Hi, I'm George Kurtz, co-founder and CEO of CrowdStrike. I'm joined today by Mike Sentonas, our worldwide Chief Technology Officer, and we're coming to you from Black Hat, and we're going to do a product snapshot on identity. So, Mike?
We're going to dive into identity today. We've got Christian Rodriguez, SE Director for Mid-Market, one of our extraordinary SEs, and he's going to go through a demo. We're going to dive into the product, and we're going to talk about what it does, what it's uniquely placed, and why it's so important for every customer to be having.
So, Mike, we hear a lot about identity. When we think about CrowdStrike's identity, our module, what is it, what isn't it? Tell us more about what we're doing.
Well, look, at its core, it's easy to compromise identities. It's a lot easier to compromise identities than a machine. So it's no surprise that we see so many attacks that have an identity aspect, whether it's an adversary abusing identities, moving laterally inside an organization. A lot of the times you see people inside an organization with elevated privileges that they shouldn't have. Maybe they were in a role previously that required it and they've still got it, and they get compromised and the attack takes off. So we're going to go through a lot of that. We're going to talk about identity threat detection, and we're going to talk about identity threat prevention, the two key components of our offering. What you're going to see, how easy it is to deploy, frictionless. It's part of the single agent architecture that we have, and that's really important. You're not rolling out additional infrastructure. There's no network appliances. It's not a deception technology with extra features. So we're going to dive into that in the session today.
Well, I think it's as important to tell you what it does and show you exactly how it works. But what isn't it? We get a lot of questions about, what it does and what it doesn't do.
Well, a lot of people say you partner with Okta, you partner with Ping, what's the difference? At the end of the day, we're not an IDP. We're not replacing Okta, we're not replacing Ping. That's where you create your identities, that's where you manage them. We are the vendor that is securing them. We're stopping them from being abused, we're stopping that lateral movement, and we're making sure that the two technologies work very well together. And we're going to show you that in the demo when we go through that, where we're going to leverage the Okta technology together with CrowdStrike.
So specifically, it's really endpoint and workload focused, and it's going to provide some additional visibility around identity, around Active Directory, and also some zero trust prevention capabilities.
And also misconfiguration of Active Directory. That's really common, what we see, either ADFS, on-prem, in the cloud. And we're going to go through that and show you how to secure your environment, importantly, how to get visibility into those misconfigurations and make sure that you effectively stop the breach.
Yeah, and I think what's important to realize, and you talked about it before, is that identity is actually in many cases easier to compromise than specific machines. And any of the recent breaches, over the last number of years, just about all of them had some level of identity compromise. And at CrowdStrike, not only do we build endpoint and workload protection technology, but we have a world-class services team that does a lot of incident responses. And I think almost without fail, every single incident response we've done had some level of credential theft or identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about services. One of the new offerings is Falcon Complete for identity. So it's making sure that you get the benefits from the Complete team, the managed service offering together with your identity suite, which gives you that end-to-end visibility, the management, the prevention and response.
Okay, so we're going to jump into it here in a little bit. And just to, again, recap, we're focused on our Falcon platform, endpoints and workloads. We partner with folks like Okta and Ping, and we actually work seamlessly with them. And not only can we protect the endpoints, but we can protect the domain controllers and prevent things like lateral movement, which is really hard to do. And also, it has a benefit of preventing the spread of ransomware. And obviously, you want to prevent ransomware from running. But talk a little bit about how ransomware works and how if you can control the spread, that's an additional level of control.
Well, look, the simplest form, you get an email, you get tricked into clicking on a link. That's kind of the traditional way. A lot of the times today we see the adversary get into the environment and start to prepare the environment for attack. They may be moving laterally across the environment, but at the end of the day, they run that encryption process. It's not encrypting just the machine, it's moving sideways across the organization. And that's the part that causes massive damage inside the network. So there's two things that you've got to focus on. One is stop the adversary from getting into the network, stop them preparing the environment, stop the execution of ransomware, and then stop that lateral movement. You have to do all of those things today.
Okay, so
let's go to the demo.
Let's go to the demo.
Let's get Christian in.
Hey, thanks, Michael. Thanks, George. Really excited to walk you through our IDP platform. This overview really emphasizes our ability to give our customers this full view into Active Directory and their risk footprint and their risk profile. And we're doing this by capturing live authentication traffic and quickly identifying and analyzing areas of both Active Directory and Azure AD in terms of what type of risk essentially this can introduce into their environment. So we're actively capturing every authentication that happens and we're mapping that to these different categories that you see here. So think about accounts with privileged SIDs or SMB signing that's disabled, or maybe there are accounts in your environment that have compromised passwords, which we could ultimately validate against websites like Have I Been Pwned and other different repositories that focus on breaches that have happened in the past, right? Where a user may use that same password in, their, home account or maybe their corporate account, and that password is still in use and they have yet to reset that password. Or we may have services that are running in your environment that ultimately could lead to risk. So think about like, Print Spooler or things like SPN, which could lead to things like Kerber roasting attacks in the future. Every single one of these categories gives our customers visibility into the entities that belong to that category. So, who's part of this group of violators, if you will. And then also different attributes. So, privileged accounts, is this tied to a real user or a human or some type of programmatic service account? Or if you want to get into maybe an account that has, or an incident rather, that includes some type of higher severity, this is going to give you this full perspective into the user responsible for this categorization, right, of this critical severity type of alert where we'll actually help our customers go through workflows that can add that user to a watch list, identify the attributes that that user may be triggering. So this user has an excessive amount of privileges, and if you wanted to add that user to an additional watch list, or maybe identify more events, or more importantly, as an administrator, I may want to get my arms around who is this or what systems is this user logging into, and really what type of group membership are they a part of, right? Because this could be indicative to this user inheriting a tremendous amount of of memberships, given the AD configurations. You can also see things like the last time this user reset his or her password, and ultimately, the last time they logged onto a system, and whether or not this user again is being tied to a group membership that they shouldn't, which is ultimately some very high privileges. So in this case, this user has administrative privileges when they probably shouldn't, given the nature of their respective role. One amazing capability also that we continuously capture for our customers is this activity view. So we can actually show you every single time a user logs into your environment. We can identify the device that they're logging in from. But more importantly, we can show you the type of AD they're logging onto. So whether it's AD locally or whether it's Azure AD, we'll show you the actual geolocation information. So if there's an outlier where users all of a sudden logging in from a country that they historically haven't, we can actually help you identify that and ultimately create this risk profile. But more importantly, we're going to get into some really great ways we can prevent that later on. This risk profile is also a really great view into understanding previous violations that this user may have had. So we're talking about, again, that insufficient password rotation, the fact that they have an account with this privileged SID. Maybe there's an excessive amount of login activity that has happened in the past. And if you look at that timeline, you can get a really good view into what that excessive activity is, right? So maybe they've tried to authenticate to a system or a multitude of systems in the past, and that authentication has failed, and they subsequently locked their account out. All of those different activities and all of those different alerts, if you will, really attribute or contribute to this timeline that you see here, and can ultimately increase that risk score profile that you see here on the screen of 8.5, which could ultimately indicate that this is a very problematic user, or maybe this account was compromised in some campaign before, or this may be an account that requires further attention, right? So this is really great perspective, really quick snapshot for getting your arms around a user's activity.
So Christian, let me just interject, and I got a question here. Part of what we typically see, particularly in cloud environments and internal through even managed service providers that are compromised, is remote desktop and credentials being used to get access to a system, and it could be credential spraying. So are you saying that we have the ability then to be able to identify and prevent those sort of attacks?
Yeah, undoubtedly. In fact, one of the strong suits of the platform is this policy engine, which is extremely robust and flexible, across a multitude of areas. So, for example, one policy we can create around remote desktop is this access rule that says that whenever we see an attempt to log on to a domain controller via RDP, we can then enforce some type of multi-factor authentication across a multitude of vendors. So think about Duo or Okta. So in this case, we'll basically select Okta Verify for the sake of this demonstration. And basically, the policy can dictate anything from I don't want to allow this user to authenticate onto a system unless they have certain types of, capabilities on their endpoint. So, for example, do they have Falcon running on their endpoint? Or in this case, maybe they can belong to a group, or just for the sake of this demonstration, so that we're talking about more of a hygiene play. Every time a user tries to remote desktop onto a domain controller, we can create this rule that basically pushes or enforces that multi-factor authentication. And then, of course, the domain controller is kind of a high targeted asset, right? So we want that applicable to every user trying to access a DC. This is really good too, by the way, for even just overall administrative type of policy enforcement, just because naturally we would want to prevent this from an adversary perspective. But just in overall best practices, you may want to add this additional layer of security for administrative tasks, which require someone RDPing onto a domain controller. So this is a really great example of how you would apply this in a real world scenario. So in terms of the actual user experience, it's pretty simple. If we had an administrator trying to remote desktop onto a domain controller, they would log on as they normally do. But notice this window represents this administrator's mobile device where, based upon that policy that we just created, we may want to simply enforce this push capability where the administrator is then prompted with this Okta Verify MFA. And once they actually successfully validate that they are logging in, then they'll have the ability to gain access to that domain controller accordingly. So it's a really great way to enforce MFA throughout your entire enterprise without having to do some type of major modification to the way that users authenticate onto the rest of your systems.
So, Christian, if somebody gets onto a workstation and they try to steal a service account, how do we help prevent an entire domain compromise in a matter of minutes?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So, as I mentioned, we're collecting this data live, right? So, live authentication across every single account in your environment. This actually gives us the ability to help our customers create these great hunting and these search queries, right? So, for example, in that same review or overview of how we would remote desktop onto a domain controller and capture administrators that are logging in, we get to see everything from the actual type of protocol that was used. We actually get to capture the system that's in question, that's being accessed, the destination of that actual authentication request, or in the example of a service account or something that is more programmatic, we'll actually give you a full view into any type of interactive logons that may include a service account. So we saw that this device basically tried to authenticate onto a system or a handful of systems. This perspective or this view will give you a full breakdown of whether or not this was some type of programmatic account, what they logged into, whether it was an on-premise service that was accessed, the service type. The purpose here again is to get your arms around. Is there someone that's maliciously using one of my service accounts? And if so, what are they accessing? How are they accessing it? And should they be accessing it?
So, Christian, this looks like a really flexible architecture, a lot of capabilities here. I know over a number of years, customers have created specific honey tokens, privilege accounts that they want to monitor. How can we help and enhance that process?
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of the way that we do our live authentication analysis, right? So this honey token that's used in this exercise, which ultimately becomes compromised, is now going to be used on a system, right? To gain access to machine with the attempt of moving laterally or the attempt of maybe dumping credentials, to gain some type of further persistence. And we have a multitude of patterns that are built for identifying that. So not only will we see that authentication that would be anomalous, we can actually add that user to a watch list, for example. And then whenever that user authenticates, we can apply either MFA or we can monitor them or prevent that authentication from happening successfully. But then we'll have a confirmation that the honey token was leveraged successfully by an adversary, and naturally we're going to have that full visibility of that authentication traffic, a full log of every system that user tried to access, and we could ultimately shut that down very quickly. So it's a very valuable use case.
So Christian, I love the comments that you're making around hygiene. I mean, it's so incredibly important. We see a lot of customers today that have on-premise AD, they have Azure AD. Talk to the flexibility that the product gives to give people really the choice to protect their entire environment, regardless of how they've configured their environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the beauty of our platform is that we support both on-premise and Azure AD, right? And we're giving our customers a single pane of glass, if you will, with respect to everything that you saw in the demo, every single policy that we've created. Every time there's an incident across any of those environments, whether it's on-premise or cloud-based or Azure AD, and then we have this unique capability to also apply that conditional access model for authentication across both environments, again natively within what you saw within our lab. So it's an amazing capability that our customers are gravitating to in droves, if you will, only because we can uniquely support both Active Directory locally and also Azure AD, giving them that flexibility and that power that you saw here within that policy engine.
So Christian, the time traveler problem seems to be ubiquitous across many organizations, and just identifying those unique logins. Talk a little bit about how we can put all that together and make it super easy for customers to understand really what might be amiss in their environment from various logins.
Yeah, great point, George. This actually goes back to the ability that we have to view and analyze the live authentication traffic. So think about maybe someone who hasn't logged onto a system for a long time, right? That's essentially an outlier that will actually capture the attention of our platform and ultimately allow an administrator to create a policy around maybe a stale account or maybe stale credentials, or bring awareness to the fact that there is some type of rogue user that has authenticated onto a system. And because we're analyzing this traffic in real time, right, it allows us to kind of curate, if you will, who is logging on, using what type of credentials on what system. So it's an extremely powerful capability to instantly get perspective into the type of access, the type of privileges happening in real time. And that authentication traffic allows us to build these models extremely effectively, and then ultimately policies around preventing that moving forward.
So Christian, one of the things that we see as part of our incident response practice is we may go into an organization who isn't a customer, they've been attacked, they've been compromised, and we see these golden ticket attacks, which are just devastating. Talk to us about what a golden ticket attack is and just what it means in terms of cleanup and be able to identify it and, more importantly, prevent it.
Yeah, so golden ticket attacks are devastating, right? This ultimately is a point in an attack where an adversary has already established a foothold on a system. They've maybe moved laterally, they've dumped credentials, and they ultimately are now targeting your domain controller to get access to this Kerberos golden ticket, which ultimately means that they have access to every user within your environment. So again, the cleanup for an attack like this is tremendous. Of course, the larger the organization, the more time consuming it is. And again, there's a lot of resources that are wasted doing remediation for this type of very malicious activity, right? So in our world, we have a plethora of ways to get your arms around this. Naturally, the visibility play is going to be first and foremost the most important thing. We have visibility into things like NTLM relay attacks, obviously past the hash attacks. Of course, if we saw someone dumping credentials, there's a multitude of capabilities we have to prevent that naturally also. But more importantly, with, for example, that conditional access policy we walked through earlier, we have the ability to instantly enable MFA across an entire enterprise, easily via policy, right, in order to basically stop the bleeding as quickly as possible, right? Naturally, we want to prevent the attack from even getting to that point, so we have lateral movement detection and prevention capabilities. We have a tremendous amount of hygiene visibility rule sets in the platform that will prevent these types of attacks, which ultimately would lead to something as devastating as a golden ticket attack. And so, again, visibility being a very strong part of this, of understanding where the authentication is coming from, where the outliers are, enabling things like conditional access, and ultimately, prevention policies for stopping, credential theft moving forward.
So Christian, one question from me. Obviously, you've shown the ease of use of creating policies. You've shown the powerful policy engine. Can you talk a little bit about the deployment? Because obviously one of the benefits that we have is the integrated architecture with the Falcon sensor.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So what we've done is we've actually fully integrated this IDP capability into our sensor. So any customer that has our technology deployed today throughout their enterprise. As long as they have our technology running, basically Falcon running on their domain controller, they will have the ability to upgrade that version of the sensor. It's very easily all done from our console, and that will allow them to activate this module. So they'll have the ability to instantly start collecting authentication or live authentication event data on their domain controllers, and that will actually also allow them to start getting these profiles that we saw earlier, and ultimately, once they're ready, they can build those policies tied to things like conditional access, as we saw in the earlier demonstration. The module, if it's not active in your console, it can be enabled via your local team. Your field team has the ability of enabling this in your environment very quickly. And then there's also a really great section in your app store, in the CrowdStrike App Store, that gives you a full breakdown of what the sensor is, what it does, the capabilities of it being now officially embedded into Falcon, and they can get up and running within a day.
Right. So if you're a current customer, you can just request a trial. And obviously, if you are new to CrowdStrike, we'd be happy to chat with you about the platform itself, and in particular, this module and getting it up and running. And that's the beauty of what we've built. It's very quick and easy to get up and running. So Mike, let me just maybe wrap up on overall some of the benefits and the outcomes, positive outcomes that we've seen for some really, really large companies. Obviously, it applies to any company or organization that's large or small. But talk about some of the positive success stories we've had.
Well, I actually love this product snapshot format, because what you're seeing here is the exact experience that these customers get. Real simple, easy to use deployment models. We've actually had amazing success during the proof of value phase. So these organizations, customers of CrowdStrike, contact us. They contact Christian and his team and the other SEs around the world. They do an in-app trial. And during that POV process, they're seeing information that they just don't get from other tools. They're seeing that information so quickly, and suddenly they're going through that hygiene process to make sure that they fix up some of these issues. They're still in a proof of value stage. So they're cleaning up the misconfigurations, they're taking down the elevated credentials, they're taking them away, and they're moving straight away to get licensed, to get the product deployed in production, which is essentially carrying the proof of value into their production environment. So a lot of organizations that have stopped attacks, a lot of organizations that have got benefits as a result of this capability. And the feedback that they're just telling us is exactly what you saw during this product snapshot. Easy to roll out, easy to configure, easy to use UI, which we love. So I want to do more of these product snapshots.
Great. Well, we'd recommend anyone who has questions, leave your comments below. If you're looking for additional product snapshots, we're happy to put these out. And I think there's just so many capabilities that Falcon has, and we keep iterating it so quickly. I think it's important for us to highlight some of these so that prospects and customers understand the true power of the platform. So we'd love to get the feedback. Leave the comments below, and we'll hopefully see you soon.
Look forward to it.